I was on the phone with Etta Laxer, and Ron came in and he said he had just come back, I think from the JCC, where he and Carol were volunteering, giving vaccines.
Yeah.
Okay. Good deeds. Good deeds.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, as we get started,
How do I mute
I'm
my
going to
mute
share my screen right away. Now, does anybody recognize the picture right there?
No.
Nobody? There should be at least 2 people in the class now that recognize what's there.
Don't tell me it's your father.
an uncle.
I'll tell you,
like me.
like it's sort of weird, but it looks like that Leave It to Beaver when he was a kid.
No, I think I heard the person say something.
An uncle? It's
Says it
Your
looks
uncle?
like me.
It looks like you, Abe, because it is you.
oh my
That's
goodness.
I was good looking then.
And you got better looking. So this came about, Shelley sent me the picture, but we're delighted that your brother Isaac, better known as Ike, is sponsoring our class in honor of his big brother. So thank you, Ike.
Welcome.
And may we celebrate many more birthdays together.
Thank you.
Amen. Okay, now, on that note, we Faders and Tweetos observed my father's 4th yahrzeit this week, a dear friend of Abe's and many of you. And perhaps it's a coincidence, but I recalled that 4 years ago at his funeral, I began my eulogy with singing the song you're all familiar with, Achat Sha'alti Me'et Hashem, or the fast version, Achat Sha'alti Me'et Hashem. And what it means, I ask one thing of God, and I will request that and request that. Shifti b'veit Adonai kol yemei chayai, that I live in the house of God my entire life. So at the time, I said that we all know that he did exactly that. He lived under the inspiration of God his entire life, but he also expanded what Beit Adonai, the house of God, is. And he made every aspect of life a place with God's presence, whether it was studying davening or watching a movie or baseball. Now, the coincidence is, who wrote these words? They're taken from Psalms, Tehillim, written by the character that we will be discussing today, King David. And it's interesting that he makes that request, but what do we know? And this speaks to the complex character that he was. We know that he also wanted to build the Beit HaMikdash. Did he?
No.
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 Solomon, Shlomo did. Why is that?
Because
He wasn't worthy.
King David was he was a soldier.
Okay, there was too much blood on his hands. So this should be in the back of your heads, or at the top of your heads, in thinking as we discuss this character. Now, a very complicated character. I want you to try to complete the following sentence that I'm going to say that's not on the screen. Human leaders can succeed only to the extent that they, now I'm going to, if I don't hear it from you, say 3 words, but you say it as you wish. I'll say it one more time. Human leaders can succeed only to the extent that they
acknowledge their humanity.
Are worthy.
are worthy, but I heard somebody say something else. Acknowledge what?
Their humanity.
Acknowledge their humanity. Something else? Both are right, but what else? Acknowledge God's supremacy.
Okay.
Now, any one of us is supposed to do that. Be humble enough to acknowledge that there is a God, our creator, our redeemer, our revealer. Now, who is going to have the biggest issue in the Tanakh, in the Bible, in acknowledging God's supremacy? Who?
King.
The king, all right? In front of you. Okay, let's read this first text from our author, Elliott Rabin. Kings of all people have the greatest difficulty in recognizing their subservience to an authority above them, whether human or divine. The king represents the greatest threat to God, the most likely candidate to usurp God's role and prestige. In God's eyes, the king is humanity's challenge to God. Biblical kings, in particular, are figures that are trapped in the bind of biblical leaders. What do we mean by trapped? The people look to them as substitutes for God, to serve as saviors by administering the political, military, judicial, and economic needs of society. The priests, however, expect them to serve as spiritual leaders, to obey God's law above their own edicts and pronouncements. So we have 2 levels here. The people want one thing from their leader, and the priests and probably the prophets want something else from these leaders, and it's indeed a bind. Now, this first pasuk, in those days, there was no king in Israel. Following Joshua and before we have the first king, in those days, there was no king in Israel. Everyone did as he pleased. Not surprisingly, without a real leader, there's a weakened military, exposure to enemy control, and an increase in moral decay. In other words, without the king's centralized power, society falls apart. Now, we know God really was not interested in Bnei Israel, the Israelites, having a king, because he knew exactly what would happen. However, they request and God concedes. And in Samuel, he says the following, as they're requesting, and he says to the prophet Samuel, heed the demand of the people in everything they say to you by asking for a king, for it is not you that they have rejected, it is me they have rejected as their king. He takes them out of Mitzrayim, Egypt, for the sole purpose, builds up, of them recognizing that a human king will never rule over them again, never let there be another Paro, and the King of Kings, God, should be the only king in their lives. But still, what happens? So, on a practical level, kingship is necessary. We need what kings do, part of what they do. On a religious level, kingship, says Rabin, kingship is an apostasy. Now, both these assertions are valid and true. And that's what makes leadership very difficult. You rarely find a leader, one human being, who's going to be able to bring those two qualities or talents together. So we've had kings in Israel
Watch this if you
who
don't
have
want.
been uniters, protectors, legislators, builders, symbols of strength and national pride. But we've also had kings, and maybe these same individuals, who have also been idolaters, oppressors, dividers, fomenters of destruction to themselves and the nation. Where does Melech David, King David, fall in within this structure? Without a doubt, David remains for us the model of the ideal king. And you see that throughout the Tanakh, not just when he's being discussed, but in many parts of the Tanakh, you will see that the narrator will write something, this particular king, halach b'derech David, went in the way of David. Or it will say, unfortunately,
Did not. Okay.
did not walk in the way of David. And you will see Nevi'im, prophets, longing to have another David. And at the end of days, Ezekiel, Yechezkel, longs to retrieve this ideal of David. Why did God have such a positive attitude toward David? Anyone?
From the very beginning, David always looked to God for his strength, and he always recognized God. And there was never a question of him being on the same footing as God or being a replacement to God. He always had this faith and this belief in God.
Absolutely. Thank you, Michael. Here, when he is anointed, and Samuel took the horn of oil and anointed him in the midst of his brothers, and a spirit of the Lord passed over David from that day forth. And Samuel arose and went to Ramah. What is the key phrase here? Ruach Adonai, the spirit
It is
of God. But then what it goes on to say, it passed over David from that day forth. Not just then, but always. And even in his later years, when he perhaps didn't appear to be as innocent as we might like to believe he was. No. So this is very interesting. Now, this doesn't mean that the king before him, Saul, wasn't given the Spirit of God. He was. But without going into details, scholars will tell you that no other king was as aware, and it might sound funny knowing certain things about David, no other king was as aware of his role in holding on to that Spirit of God. Keep that in mind as well. Now, David, as Michael said, was always doing what he did for God. What does that mean, to do something for God? It means that he can be ambitious because he wants to do for God and for his people. And what it means is he's not doing it for self-glory. And we've discussed that usually a hero, and certainly a king or a general, did it precisely for that reason. Now, how do we see David when we meet him? And while he was speaking with them, when they're going to have this conflict with the Philistines, behold, the champion named Goliath, the Philistine from Gath, was coming up from the ranks of the Philistines, and he spoke the same words, and David heard. David had just arrived as almost an afterthought. It's clear that Samuel is looking to have a new king, and the father sends David along to bring certain things to his older brothers without even thinking that David would be the one that would save the day. Okay. And all the men of Israel, upon seeing the man, Goliath, fled from before him and were exceedingly frightened. And the men of Israel said, have you seen this man who is coming up? For he is coming up to taunt Israel. And it will be that the man who will kill him, the king, will enrich him with great riches. And he will give him his daughter, and he will make his father's house free in Israel. And David said to the men who were standing before him, saying, what shall be done to the man who slays that Philistine and takes away reproach from Israel? For who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should taunt the ranks of the living God? And the people said to him, so shall be done to the man who slays him. And Elliott, David's eldest brother, heard when he spoke to the men, and Eliab's wrath was kindled against David. And he said, why have you come down? With whom have you left those few sheep in the desert? I know you're impetuous and the evil of your heart, for you have come down in order to see the war. And David said, what have I done now? Is it not but a word? And he turned around from him toward another, and he spoke according to the same manner. The people answered according to the former manner. And the words which David had spoken were heard, and they related them before Shaul, and he took him. And David said to Shaul, let no man's heart fail because of him. Your bondsman, meaning me, I will go and battle with the Philistine. And Shaul said to David, you are unable to go to this Philistine to battle with him. You are a lad, and he is a warrior since his youth. And David said to Saul, your bondsman was a shepherd of sheep for his father, and there came a lion and also a bear and carried off a lamb from the flock. And I went after him and smote him and saved it from his mouth. And he arose upon me, and I took hold of his jaw. I smote him and slew him. Who is this reminding you of? Last week when we talked about Samson. But what is going to be a key difference? Both, David continues, the lion and the bear has your bondsman slain, and the uncircumcised Philistine shall be like one of them. For he taunted the armies of the living God. He, as we heard earlier, always attributes victory and success to God. And David said, the Lord who saved me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear, he will save me from the hand of the Philistine. And Saul said to David, go, and may the Lord be with you. Now, one could have thought in the first few psukim of that selection that maybe Eliab, his eldest brother, knew something about David, that he was anxious to go to battle. Some even say that David might have been like Joseph, always telling his brothers, I'm going to do this and I'm going to do that. It's just a midrash. But what makes him different from somebody who is anxious to go to battle, Rabin asserts, is his constant mentioning of God and attributing to him. And this is where David's strength is. He continues with Goliath, and the Philistine was continuously drawing nearer to David, and the man who bore the shield was before him. And the Philistine looked and saw David, and he despised him, for he was a youth and ruddy with an attractive appearance. And the Philistine said to David, am I a dog that you come to me with sticks? And the Philistine cursed David by his God. And the Philistine said to David, come to me, and I shall give your flesh to the fowl of the air and to the cattle of the field. And David said to the Philistine, you come to me with sword, spear, and javelin, and I come to you with the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, which you have taunted. He goes on, this day the Lord will deliver you into my hand, and I shall slay you and take off your head And I shall give the carcasses of the camp of the Philistines this day to the fowl of the air and to the beasts of the earth. And all the earth shall know that Israel has a God. This is unheard of from other such characters in history, attributing their strength and being saved by God. Now, I need to ask you, and be honest, is there anyone who is sitting here as we are saying this and we are praising David? I did say that he's complicated, but I left it at that. Is there anyone sitting here saying, well, are we going to look at the other David? Is there anyone?
No.
No?
Yes.
Feel free.
I'm waiting with bated breath.
Okay, I'm surprised because I know a few of you told me once, many years ago, that I actually crushed David for you in giving you certain information that you weren't aware of. Okay, so let's now,
You see the other
And-
side. Okay.
please remember,
Bracha,
we still, yes,
do you mind just zooming in? At the top it says Zoom 63. Can you make it bigger, please?
63%.
so I understand you got back to Givat Shmuel, okay?
Yes.
And thank you for doing that because I was having a problem getting it bigger.
Okay, good. Yeah.
Okay, so now let's indeed see another side of David.
Womanizer.
Feet of clay.
Okay. Clearly, in the role of king, David was successful, but not always as a family man, as a father. But keep in mind, till this day, we still sing David Melech Yisrael Chai V'Kayam. Keep that in mind as we now look at the other side. And it came to pass at the time of evening that David arose from his bed and walked upon the roof of the king's house, and he saw a woman bathing from the roof, and the woman was very beautiful. And David sent and inquired about the woman. And he said, is this not Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam, the wife of Uriah the Hittite? And David sent messengers, and he took her, and she came to him, and he lay with her, and she was purified from her uncleanliness, and she returned to her house. And the woman conceived, and she sent, and she told David, and she said, I am pregnant. And David said to Joab, general, send me Uriah the Hittite, who you see has been off in battle. And David knew that. And Joab sent Uriah to David. And Uriah came to him, and David inquired concerning the welfare of Joab and the peace of the people and the welfare of the war. And David said to Uriah, go down to your house. Before we go on, let's do a recap here. So David's army is off in battle. David did not go. he notices this beautiful Bathsheba. He knows she is married to this Uriah. And despite that, he has relations with her. Now, it's very interesting. When you read commentaries, there are those who have a problem with seeing the side of David, and they'll even explain, well, you know, she really wasn't married at this point.
Well,
Why? Anybody know why? Because there was a tradition of when a man would go off to war, he would write a conditional bill of divorce so that in the event that he's killed or he doesn't come back from war, the wife won't have to marry the brother or won't be an aguna. So there are those who say it wasn't so terrible what David did. Rabin doesn't feel like that helps our case for saying that biblical characters, even King David, Shachai v'Kayam, don't do that. Let him be complicated, and just not complicated, but also maybe have this negative side. But then what does he do? Why does he tell Yoav to send back Uriah from the battlefield? And then why does he tell Uriah to go to the house? Anyone?
He wants him to have relations with his own wife so that he won't be held responsible for her pregnancy.
Exactly, Bev. He's already projecting that, she's told me she's pregnant. How is that going to look? Which means he believes that Uriah is not divorced from her. And so he wants to create a scene so that it'll be clear enough that Uriah is the father. However, it came to pass in the morning that David wrote a letter to Joab, and he sent it by hand of Uriah. And he wrote in the letter saying, place Uriah at the forefront of the fiercest battle and go away from him so that he will be hit and will die. What happens? Uriah did not listen to King David. He did not go to his house. And he ends up telling the general and David, he says, how could I go back to my house and be comfortable when my fellow soldiers are fighting? So no. So now David has to come up with another plan. And what's his plan? Tell him to go away from him so that he will be hit and will die. Look what our King David is willing to do. To let this Uriah die just to save face. That's murder. Now, those same people who tried to defend David, what do they say about this? They say, well, you know, Uriah really deserved the death penalty because we know that he was trying to rebel against David, and anybody who rebels against a king is not loyal, gets the death penalty. Rabin says, no, that's not a factor here. I want to see David in these two horrendous deeds. Or else we're copping out from our theme. And the mourning period passed, and David sent and gathered Bathsheba to his house, and she became his wife, and she bore him a son. And the thing that David did was displeasing to the Lord. So the same God who has admired and been with David and had a positive attitude toward him still is with him. We'll see that. But he does not accept what he's done. How can he get away with this? So now, what happens? You know, There's an ongoing conflict throughout the Tanakh between kings and Nevi'im. The prophets, like the priests, are messengers of God, and the king really is meant to be as well. But who would believe that a prophet would have the chutzpah to criticize a king? But that's part of what the job of the Navi, the prophet, was, together with giving constructive criticism to the Israelites. And so, once this happens, God calls on the prophet Natan and tells him, you have got to castigate the king. Now, Natan is no fool, and even if he knows it's his job, he thinks and strategizes, how can I get David to listen to me? And he calls upon him saying, I need you to give me some advice. So David meets with him. And the Lord sent Natan to David. And he came to him and said to him, listen to this story. There were two men in one city, one rich and one poor. The rich man had very many flocks and herds, but the poor man had nothing save one little ewe lamb which he had bought and reared. And it grew up together with him and his sons. Of his bread it would eat, and from his cup it would drink, and in his bosom it would lie, and it was to him like a daughter. And there came a wayfarer to the rich man, and he spared to take of his own flock and of his own herd to prepare for the guest that had come to him. And he took the poor man's lamb and prepared it for the man that had come to him. And David became very angry at the man, and he said to Natan, as the Lord lives, the man who has done this is liable to death. And the lamb he shall repay fourfold, because he did this thing and because he had no pity. And Natan, of course, says to David, you are the man. So says the Lord God of Israel, I anointed you as king over Israel, and I delivered you from the hand of Shaul. And I gave you the house of your master and your master's wives in your midst. And I gave you the house of Israel and of Judah. And if that were too little, then would I add unto you like them and like them. Why have you despised the word of the Lord to do what is evil in his eyes? You have smitten Uriah, the Hittite, with the sword, and you have taken his wife for yourself as a wife, and you have slain him with the sword of the children of Ammon. And now the sword shall never depart from your household forever, because you have despised me, and you have taken the wife of Uriah the Hittite to be your wife. So says the Lord, behold, I will raise up against you evil out of your own house. Your family is going to suffer. Now that's a whole other issue. And I will take your wives before your eyes, and I will give them to your friend, and he will lie with your wives in the sight of the sun. For you have acted in secrecy, but I will do this thing before all Israel and before the sun. I will embarrass you, king. And David does something that no other king would have done. And David says to Natan, Chatati, I have sinned against the Lord. And Natan said to David, also the Lord has removed your sin. You shall not die. What are you thinking or feeling at this point? there's no right or wrong, or don't worry that you're going to be thrown out of David's kingdom. Say what you feel.
I think it's incredible how honest that our Tanakh is, that we have this leader we look up to, and yet he's human. He makes mistakes, big mistakes. And we see that, God said, look, this is something terrible you did. And right away, when he hits it, David says, you're right. I've sinned. He admits it. He's a king and he admits he did wrong. And then the prophet says, God has removed your sin to the point that you will not die, but your family will suffer later because of this.
Okay.
So
Does everyone agree with Michael?
I have a different view.
Go ahead.
It sounds incredibly Christian to me. It sounds like a confessional, say 3 Hail Marys and that's it. It seems too simplistic. All that David has done so far is to admit that he did sin, which he knows the Lord knows because the Lord knows everything. And then immediately Natan says, okay, you're absolved. Don't worry about it.
Okay. Does somebody want to respond?
Yeah,
to
from
what
a
we
Jewish
just
perspective, it reminds me of Yom Kippur. I think it shows that God recognizes we're human, that we give in to temptation at times, we make mistakes, and that God forgives us if we atone.
We do a lot of atoning before we're forgiven, though.
You have to look at the verse 11 as well, because God didn't just forgive him. He forgave him to the point that it wasn't going to kill him. He's still going to suffer. 11 points out, you're going to see your wives will be taken before your eyes. That he will suffer, David. So it's not just like a whitewash, like in Christianity, where Hail Mary and you're forgiven. It's not the same.
Okay. I'd like to add, are you saying that these 2 acts of taking Bathsheba and killing Uriah, they destroy the other image we have of David totally? An image of him always thinking of God? Now, was he thinking of God in those 2 acts? No. Or can we say that, like every human being, has a weakness? Now, of course, granted, having somebody killed, that's a pretty big weakness. But what is it? Why would God spare David if he's done this and he finds it displeasing? Is there something that he's recognizing? Sometimes people are harder on human beings than perhaps God is. Is he feeling confident enough that David had a bad moment? Other times when he was violent, it was against an enemy, and that he trusted, because of other actions of David, that was the truer him. Throwing this out.
Bracha, I think that God saw an inner knowledge in David that he was willing to that had always been there. He always acknowledged God for his successes, and at this point he also acknowledges that God knows his weaknesses. And so God looks at him as this fallible human being who can do good things for his people. And that's the way I look at it. I don't think it's, I mean, as we know later in the story, he's going to suffer a lot because of this deed. But there is a lot of good stuff that comes out in between the suffering.
Okay, so putting all this together, I don't want to again just say life is complicated. But again, let's keep in mind, I said, that we still call David the most ideal. And this is somebody that we look up to. However, what we don't do, and what we're not meant to do with anyone, is idolize him. Now, I think when Marlene says he internalized, or he has this inner, you know, as I began, that David was from the start somebody who played instruments and was a poet. And he ultimately is responsible for Tehillim, the Psalms that you and I say on different occasions. Now, he listens to Natan, and then he goes on to reflect. And this is just one example of one of the Psalms that he says, Psalm 51, for the conductor, a song of David, when Natan the prophet came to him, when he went to Bathsheba. Be gracious to me, O God, according to your kindness, according to your great mercies. Erase my transgressions. Wash me thoroughly of my iniquity and purify me of my sin. Or I know my transgressions, and my sin is always before me. Against you alone have I sinned, and I have done what is evil in your sight, in order that you be justified in your conduct and right in your judgment. So, is it now that he's just simply saying, I sinned, and expects all to be good? And as we've heard, his family goes through a lot. The child that is born doesn't survive. So who is this David?
Well, Bracha,
Go ahead.
I think the main point may be that he is humility, that, you know, we as human beings, no matter how great our power, if we don't subjugate ourselves and recognize a greater being, then we're lost. So he does, and maybe that's why he is so elevated in our approval.
Yeah, I think so. And it's scary though, that even somebody who is so humble and somebody who's admired, I'll say, gets away with murder. I mean, you know, so look what Rabin says about this. The Psalms, Tehillim, present a picture of David up close, speaking from the heart, confessing his faults, laying bare his fears and struggles. Whereas in the books of Samuel, David's exclamation, I stand guilty before the Lord, offers one of few moments of spiritual authenticity in which the biblical reader encounters a living person behind the mask. Meaning, this is the real David. In the Psalms, practically the entire book gives voice to that genuine inner life. Rendered in first person, these prayers, David's conversations with God, speak directly, authentically, and powerfully to his contrition and fear, rage and joy. Like all great lyric poetry, their personal quality has enabled readers through the ages to identify with his feelings. David's I is simultaneously him and the multitudes who make these prayers their own. In so doing, the Psalms recast David as a far more compelling and comprehensible hero. The Psalm shows David spiritually reorienting himself, acknowledging his mistakes, and casting himself on God's mercy. It transforms the flawed, opaque figure of biblical history into a hero of spiritual life, a man who wrestles with pangs of conscience, voices genuine penitence, and finds hope in his faith in God's justice. It also helps to transform our relationship to David, revealing a glimpse of warm blood in the cold heart of this ambitious, conflicted king. Ulai. Now, one more character to discuss. God. What would be the most valuable teaching we can glean from God as biblical role model? I'll repeat that. What would be the most valuable teaching we can glean from God as a biblical role model? I'm going to give you two paradigms. One from the Talmud. One, Rabbi Chama, son of Rabbi Hanina, says, "What is the meaning of that which is written? After the Lord God shall you walk, and him shall you fear, and his commandments shall you keep, and unto his voice shall you hearken, and him shall you serve, and unto him shall you cleave." But is it actually possible for a person to follow the divine presence? But hasn't it already been stated? For the Lord your God is a devouring fire, a jealous God, and one cannot approach fire. He explains, rather, the meaning is that one should follow not God, the essence of God, but his attributes, the attributes of the Holy One, blessed be he. He provides several examples. Just as he clothes the naked, as it is written, and the Lord God made for Adam and for his wife garments of skin and clothe them, so too should you clothe the naked. That's something we should imitate. Malbish arumim. Just as the Holy One, blessed be he, visits the sick, bikur cholim, as it is written with regard to God's appearing to Avram following his circumcision, and the Lord appeared unto him by the terebinths of Mamre, so too should you visit the sick. Just as the Holy One, blessed be he, consoles mourners, as it is written, and it came to pass after the death of Avram that God blessed Isaac his son, so too should you console mourners. Now, this is a very nice paradigm. God introduces us to different acts that we should do for other people. Before I look at the next, can anyone suggest something else that God role models for us?
Well, justice and mercy.
Okay. Yep.
There's also feeding the hungry and being, taking care of those who are less fortunate, making sure we're aware of the widow and the orphan.
Okay, so some more good deeds, and he should be a symbol of the necessity for justice, tzedek. Okay, so let's look. Rabin says the following: once established, these ideals mentioned above, loving kindness, acts of chesed, justice, once they have taken on a reality of their own, independent of their creator, they have been used not only to judge people, but to judge God. Now, what's the prime example of when God is questioned about him living according to his principles? What's the prime example?
The Holocaust.
Okay, that's a modern day example. But in the Bible, when Abraham questions what's going to happen in Sodom, whether God is acting faithfully according to God's own principles. Remember what Abraham says to him, and twice, it almost is sacrilege. Shall not the judge of all the earth deal justly? Are you really going to kill the innocent with the bad? You never see God get angry at Abraham for doing that, or for when Moshe also questions God's justice. It's almost as if God is a parent who is happy that his children have internalized messages that he's given his child. What Avram and Moshe say is that God's judgments are expected to reveal the same moral integrity that God expects of human action. Why is this so significant? That perhaps, no doubt, God being a role model and telling us do this good act, do that great act is very, very important. But think of what God is saying. If you can judge me, then certainly you can judge the leaders in the Tanakh, the kings in the Tanakh, the people we call heroes. That is a lifelong task. Judging others, and more importantly, that every human being, including a king, is to self-reflect. That we have to recognize that everyone is going to do wrong. We are all flawed. And it hurts more if it's somebody public and a leader on one level. But that's ultimately how we have to see all of our leaders. No one is perfect. And we all have to remember that in God, letting himself be judged is saying, then certainly human beings need to be judged, rebuked, constructively criticized, and we need, God has given us a book that shows we need a king who can lead us on a practical level, and we need a leader who can raise us on the religious level, but that is not going to be an easy task. You're delusional if you think that you will find somebody like that. Now that's hard to swallow. That's very hard to swallow. So, any thoughts as we conclude this set of 4 discussions of characters in our Tanakh? Will everybody continue singing David Melech Israel?
A little more slowly.
A little more slowly.
Well, you've hit upon something that is so really troubling that, you know, it makes it very difficult for a modern day person to accept that God. And I hope I'm not opening too big a can of worms, but you know, there's just so much evil in the world. There's also a lot of good, but it makes it very hard to grasp those ideals that are presented in the Bible.
Wait, Linda, you have to be clearer. Which ideals is it hard to accept?
A God of justice and mercy, a God that we can reprimand God because he's to be. It's just too difficult, and I don't know that there's answers. I mean, I think that humans need faith, and they need faith in something greater than them so that we behave with humility. But as a modern person, I think probably for young people today, it's challenging. I'm sorry, everybody.
Oh, no.
I'm just thinking we also have to remember the times that these events occurred. And,
Go ahead.
Like sometimes, when we compare it to what's going on in other groups and societies at that time, this was quite, this was quite advanced. Again, like as you were saying, most times kings don't ask for forgiveness. And they're just totally vicious in killing all kinds of people, and they're doing all kinds of sacrifices, so that for that period of time, again, it's unfair to judge him by our standards today.
That's very interesting, Bev. Okay. Linda, if you're not satisfied with that, Bev, you can talk privately. Stephen.
I do not have much of a problem with King David or Moses.
Okay, good.
Or
Anybody else? Go on.
Anyone, because they reflect the reality of humans then and now. That's what makes us distinctive from other people.
Reality.
We live in the real world. The Christians
Yeah,
don't.
absolutely.
They have somebody else who's going to take the responsibility of your evil doing.
Okay. Okay. I thought I saw another hand. Gloria, yeah, unmute yourself. Gloria, unmute yourself. Still not unmuted. Okay. Yes.
Listening to all this and thinking about King David, and the phrase keeps coming through my head: take his crown off. You know what the words are? I am just a man. He's not perfect. He wasn't created perfect, but at least he realizes that he has done wrong. And even though God's not going to say, okay, off with your head tomorrow kind of thing, he's got to live with this for the rest of his life. And I think that that has a great influence from this point on, how he will conduct himself. He might fall off again, but I don't know anybody who's 100% perfect. Not in this world anyway.
Okay. Thank you. Anybody else?
Bracha, in your reference to Abraham and Moshe, it really struck home, because in many ways they were acting in the same way that Natan acted with David. He was calling David the king up short, and Abraham and Moshe were calling God up short. And there was another line that Rabin wrote that really struck home with me, because I always wonder why people recite Tehillim when somebody is sick and when bad things are happening to good people. And the line about a glimpse of warm blood in the cold heart really struck home with me as to why that practice is continually followed.
Yeah, no, Tehillim can be said at different times, sometimes out of joy, but we say it in Yizkor, we say it You will see people sitting outside of hospital rooms saying it, certainly here. You will see on buses. There's some people who drive on the buses, ride on the buses, not the drivers, and they are constantly reading Tehillim.
Have to ride on the roads in Israel, it's no wonder.
For sure.
Absolutely. But, you know, there's something about the fact that the same person, David, who's buried not that far from here, on Har Zion, but he wasn't permitted. That's so reflects this notion of how complicated. You need him to fight the battles, but then he doesn't have the right to build the Beit HaMikdash, the temple. Similar, perhaps, to Moshe, going all that way and then not being able to go into the promised land. A little different, but that really sums it up. That on the one hand, God, you wanted me to fight these battles, because God is still saying, we need one place that is perhaps the Beit HaMikdash that is on a different level. We're up and down, our feet on the earth and our heads looking toward heaven, Esa Einai, and wondering where our help is going to come from. Very, very complicated.
Bracha, it's interesting though that David was not allowed to build the temple, but Solomon, who was known as the greatest philanderer going, probably past, present, and future, was allowed to build the temple.
Oh, come on, Marlene, get with it. Do you know any political leader that's not a philanderer?
Oh, I don't know them personally. I would have to be a guess.
Oh, yeah.
That doesn't
But
make
he's
it right.
perfect.
Who, did you say somebody?
I said that doesn't make it right.
No, of course it doesn't make it right. Of course it doesn't make it right. But that, God is saying there, though, that there's a difference between being a philanderer and having blood on your hands. There are, not every thief is a murderer.
Okay.
Anyway, we're just meant to raise issues here. Friends, I see Batya there, and she's in the Tel Aviv area. And I wasn't sure I was going to, but she told me the other day, she said, you're going to have to mention this to the people of Bet Tikva during your class, because you've grown up with this person, Sakti. Sakti is a real character.
Who's Saki?
Saki,
Of course.
Saki, there might be a couple of you, but only a couple of you don't know him. And he is a hero to us, and you read his stories. He just lost his wife this week, 59,
Oh,
to cancer.
Sorry.
And
Oh, too bad.
Batya said, you got to share this, because you've been part of his life. He's been a part of your lives.
Absolutely.
And thank God he's blessed with 4 children and many grandchildren. And yeah, but he has been a leader. He has been a leader. And Nachum and I were not able to go to the funeral because she has corona, and you can't tell, can you? I have an inner ear problem, but I was okay. But David represented us, and it was actually on the day of my father's Yeret site, and somehow it felt full circle. Anyway, we should have simchas.
Amen. Amen.
Amen.
Hey,
And Abe, may we be together for the 93rd, and you were cute. Okay.
thank,
And thank you, Ike, again.
My pleasure.
Okay.
Moledet Sameach.
Yom Huledet Sameach.
Yeah, Miss Linda.
I loved listening to your father's stories of Saki. I loved that, going to shul and listening to them.
Yeah. We all did.
It was a
We all did.
highlight.
Yeah.
Be well.
Okay. I will pass on to him your condolences.
Thank you.
Take
Please.
care.
Yeah.
Stay well.
Pick the community too.
Yeah.
Yeah.